The assembly rooms at Ashcombe smelled of beeswax and candle smoke, and every chair along the long wall had been given over to the county's better families, so that when Eleanor Vane came through the side door with a crate of rebound volumes balanced against her hip, she came through it alone and unremarked, and exactly as she had expected to. She had 6 books to deliver before the reading began. Mrs. Pruitt's Household Bible, its spine relaid in tooled calf. 2 volumes of sermons for the vicar. A schoolbook for the squire's daughter, its corners built up new where small hands had worn them through. She moved along the back of the room with her chin level and her basket steady, and she had nearly reached the subscription table when a voice, pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to and no farther, said behind her shoulder, to no one who required telling, that it was a curious thing, was it not? How a tradesman's daughter contrived to be present at every gathering that mattered, as though trade might be mended by proximity to better company. Eleanor did not turn. She set Mrs. Pruitt's Bible on the table with both hands so that it would not be heard to shake, and she went on to the next. It was the Dowager Marchioness of Camden who had spoken, though she had not troubled to lower her voice for the purpose, and the 2 ladies flanking her laughed the small, complicit laugh of women who had decided long before which direction their laughter would fall. Eleanor felt the heat come up under her collar and willed it back down before it could reach her face. She had heard worse. She had heard it from crueler mouths, in smaller rooms, where there had been no subscription list to soften it, and no 10 shillings changing hands to make her presence, for one evening, a kind of business, rather than a trespass. She was setting the sermons before the vicar when she became aware, in the particular way a room makes itself known to a person who has spent a lifetime not being looked at, that someone was watching her without pretending otherwise. He stood near the terrace doors, a tall man in a dark blue coat, cut close through the shoulder, and he was not attending to the dowager's remark at all, though he must have heard it, standing where he stood. He was looking at Eleanor's hands. She became conscious, absurdly, of the ink stain worked permanently into the side of her right forefinger, a small gray ghost of 100 late evenings at her father's bench, and she resisted the urge to close her hand around it. He did not look away when she noticed him looking. That was the strange part. Most gentlemen, caught, glanced elsewhere with the practiced ease of men who had never once had to hold a gaze they had not meant to be caught in. He simply held hers a moment longer, gravely, as though there were something in her face he was in the middle of reading and did not wish to lose his place in. Someone said his name behind her, low, informing a neighbor. The Marquess of Camden, home from Kent a fortnight only. And not yet, the neighbor added with satisfaction, promised to anyone, though it was generally understood that Lady Frances Pelham stood first in the running, and had stood first since the cradle. Very nearly. Eleanor set the schoolbook before the squire's daughter and did not permit herself to look toward the terrace doors again. She had learned, at 17, precisely what became of shopkeepers' daughters who allowed themselves to be caught looking twice at a man whose mother had opinions about trade, and she had no intention of relearning it at 24 in a room full of witnesses for the price of a subscription evening. What she did not yet know, and could not have known, standing at the table with her basket lightening at last, was that the Marquess of Camden had buried a sister 9 years before in a marriage his mother had arranged with the same cool efficiency she had just now turned upon a bookbinder's daughter in a borrowed shawl, and that he had promised himself, at the graveside, in a silence he had kept faithfully ever since, that he would not stand by a second time and watch his mother choose for someone he loved. He did not yet know that he loved anyone. That would come later. Slowly, the way most true things came to him, built up in small observed increments rather than delivered all at once. Something in him had already begun the accounting. There in the doorway, watching a young woman refuse to let her hands shake. If you have ever stood in a room and been looked at by exactly one person as though you were the only true thing in it, you will know already what this evening cost her and what it was about to give her. Stay a while. She is worth the waiting. The reading began before Eleanor could leave, a clergyman's nephew declaiming Cowper with more feeling than skill, and she found herself a place near the back wall, behind the ranked chairs, where she might listen without being asked to sit among people who would rather she had not come at all. She had not expected to enjoy it. She had come for the 10 shillings and the chance to be seen delivering good work to houses that might send more of it her way. The poem proved a fine one, though, and the room, for all its unkindness, held itself still and attentive around the words, and for a quarter of an hour she forgot to hold her hands where they would not be noticed. She became aware, near the reading's end, that the Marquess had crossed half the room and now stood not 4 feet from where she leaned against the paneling. He said nothing. He did not need to. He simply stood beside her, facing the reader as she did, as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world for a Marquess to stand at the back wall with the bookbinder's daughter, rather than in the row of chairs kept empty for exactly his rank. When the poem ended, and the room came up out of its stillness into applause, he inclined his head to her, once, gravely, and said, before he turned away, that he had a book at home in want of exactly her kind of mending, and that he would send word. He was gone before she could answer. She stood with her hand pressed flat against her own collarbone, feeling her heart going far too quickly for a man who had said nothing more than a sentence about bookbinding, and told herself, quite firmly, that it meant nothing at all. She was wrong, though she would not learn how wrong for some months yet, and the learning of it would cost both of them a great deal before it gave them anything back. Ashcombe in October kept its shops open past dark for the traveling trade, and Eleanor's shop, wedged between a chandler's and a milliner's on the lower High Street, kept its lamp lit longest of all, because there was no one now to tell her to bank the fire and go up to bed. Her father had died in March. Quietly. In his chair at the bench, with a half-finished spine in his lap and his spectacles still on. And Eleanor had buried him. And then, because there had been no time to do otherwise, had simply gone on binding books the next morning, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant the shop closed within the month. The shop had never been rich. Josiah Vane had bound books because he loved the making of them, not because the making of them had ever paid particularly well, and what little the business earned had gone, for the better part of a decade, toward a debt he had taken on to keep the lease when the freehold changed hands, a debt now held, since his death, by his own nephew, a man named Silas Vane, who had never once set foot inside the shop while his uncle lived, and had visited it twice since the funeral, both times to inquire, with an unconvincing show of family feeling, whether Eleanor had considered how a young woman alone might manage such a burden. She managed it by working past midnight most nights, and eating less than she once had, and telling no one, least of all Silas, precisely how close the margin ran. She had Tam, an old apprentice of her father's, who had gone half-blind at the clothes work, and stayed on now mostly for company, and the small tasks his eyes still permitted, and she had Mrs. Prudence Hale from 2 doors down, who brought soup on the nights the lamp burned latest, and asked no questions Eleanor did not wish to answer. Beyond that, she had the shop, and the debt, and a resolve that had not yet been tested by anything worse than grief and arithmetic. The book arrived from Camden House on a wet Tuesday, carried by a footman who set it on her counter with the particular care of a man who had been told, at length, of its importance. It was a slim volume of poems, its binding cracked through at the joint, and one board hanging by a thread of old glue. and when Eleanor opened the cover to assess the damage she found, in a young woman's careful hand, an inscription. For Charlotte, from her brother, on her 16th birthday, with more affection than either of us is permitted to say aloud. She did not ask the footman who Charlotte had been. Something in the inscription's second clause told her she should not need to. And something in her told her, with the accuracy of a person who read wounds for a living in other people's ruined bindings, that the book had not been sent to her merely for mending. The Marquess came himself to collect it 3 weeks later, on an afternoon when the shop was empty, and the rain had driven most of the high street indoors, and he stood a long moment at the counter, with the restored volume in his hands, before he said anything at all. He asked her, at last, how she had known to match the end papers to the original pattern rather than replace them with something newer. She told him she had not known. She had simply thought that a book given in affection ought to be returned looking as much like itself as care could make it. Something moved behind his face when she said this. Brief and quickly mastered, the way a held breath moves a chest without ever quite becoming visible. He paid her more than she had asked, and when she began to protest it, he said, in a voice pitched low and level, that she looked as though she had not eaten since morning, and that there was a bakehouse 2 doors down, and that she ought to sit down and have something before she returned to her bench. It was not phrased as a request. Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime being commanded by people with far less concern for her welfare than this particular command seemed to carry, found she did not mind it nearly so much as she ought to have. She did not go to the bakehouse. She thought about the command for the better part of the evening, though turning it over the way she might turn a well-made joint, looking for the seam. The dowager's opinion of the visit reached Eleanor before the week was out, carried, as such things generally are, by a person who believed herself to be doing a kindness. Mrs. Hale had it from her sister, who had it from a housemaid at Camden House, that her ladyship had remarked, over her chocolate, that it was one thing for a Marquess to have his books mended by a tradesman's daughter, and quite another for him to make a habit of standing about her counter as though she were a person of consequence, and that she trusted her son knew the difference, even if the girl herself did not. Eleanor set down the shears she had been holding, and did not say anything at all. There was nothing to say. The dowager had not been wrong, precisely, only cruel. And Eleanor had long ago stopped expecting the two to travel separately where her own name was concerned. She saw him again at the harvest supper the village held each October in the long barn behind the church, an evening open to every family in the parish regardless of station, which was the only reason Eleanor attended dances at all. He found her near the trestle tables, where she had gone to avoid the dancing rather than to be found, and he asked her, without any preamble she could identify, whether her father had taught her the trade himself, or whether she had come to it another way. She told him about Josiah Vane. She had not meant to tell him so much. The whole small history of a man who had loved the particular silence of a bindery in the evening more than he had ever loved company, who had taught his only daughter to read a book's construction the way other fathers taught their daughters to read a room, who had died with his spectacles on and a half-finished spine in his lap, because he had never once, in 30 years, learned to stop working before the work was done. The Marquess listened with his whole attention, which she had not known until that moment was a thing a person could give and withhold, like money. And when she finished, he told her, quietly, that he understood something of what it was to keep working at a thing, because stopping meant admitting what its absence would cost. She asked him what he meant. He did not answer at once. He looked past her, toward the barn's open doors and the dark beyond them, and said only that it was a long story, and not one for a harvest supper, and that he hoped she would permit him to tell it another time, when there was less music to talk over. She permitted it, she told herself, walking home under a sky gone thick with early stars, that she had permitted a great many things this autumn that she had no business permitting, and that she ought to be more careful. She was not more careful. She found, in the weeks that followed, that carefulness had become a great deal harder to manage than it had ever been before. The occasion to be careless again came sooner than she expected, in the form of a letter from Mr. Josiah Hollis, a collector from Bath with a standing interest in anything her father's shop might turn up that was old enough and rare enough to be worth his while. He had heard, through channels Eleanor did not trouble to trace, that a small volume of prayers had come into her keeping, left by a widow named Sarah Coombe, against a debt of 4 shillings the woman had been unable to pay outright, with the understanding, spoken plainly between 2 women who each knew what it was to have nothing spare, that she would redeem it the moment her circumstances allowed. Mr. Hollis offered £11 for the volume, a sum that would have cleared the better part of a quarter's interest on Silas Vane's debt at a stroke, and he offered it in a letter written with the confident carelessness of a man who did not imagine the answer could be no. Eleanor wrote back that the book was not hers to sell. She did not know that the Marquess had come to the shop that same afternoon, drawn by no purpose he could afterward name precisely, and had stood outside the window in the thin autumn light long enough to hear the whole of the exchange through the half-open door, Mr. Hollis's agent grown red and insistent, offering more, offering considerably more, and Eleanor, in a shop that could not spare 4 shillings without feeling the loss of it for a fortnight, saying no, again, in a voice that did not shake, because the book belonged to a woman who had trusted her with it, and trust of that particular kind was not a thing she had ever learned to sell. He did not go in. He stood at the window a while longer, watching her return to her bench once the agent had gone, watching her set the widow's prayer book carefully back into the drawer she kept for such things, and something in him that had been closed for 9 years, since a graveside and a promise he had made to no one but himself, opened a further degree than it had opened for anyone since. He came to the shop the following week with a commission that required no urgency at all, a family Bible in want of new endbands, because he found he wished for a reason to sit in the narrow chair by her window and watch her hands work, and because the alternative, which was to stay away and examine at leisure exactly why he did not wish to, had begun to seem the harder undertaking of the 2. They spoke of small things at first. He asked how a spine was sewn, and she showed him, patiently, the needle and the cord, and the particular tension a good binding required, neither too slack nor too tight, and he watched her fingers with an attention she began, despite herself, to feel along her own skin like warmth held near a fire. He told her, unprompted, that he had a sister once, and stopped there, and did not go on. And Eleanor, who understood better than most people the particular etiquette of a grief not yet ready to be spoken, did not press him. He came again the week after that, and the week after that, until it became, without either of them naming it, a settled thing that the Marquess of Camden called at the bindery most Thursdays, and sat in the narrow chair, and asked questions whose true subject was rarely the one he named aloud. "Come away from the window," he told her once, on an afternoon when a cold rain had begun to work its way through the old casement, and she had gone on binding regardless, because the light was better there, and the order was due Friday. "Come and sit by the fire before you take a chill." She told him she had work to finish. He told her the work would keep, and that she would not, if she went on sitting in a draught with wet feet. And there was nothing in his voice that a stranger would have called tender, and everything in it that she felt anyway, low in her chest, the way one feels a struck bell after the sound itself has stopped. She moved to the fire. She told herself it was only sense, that a chill in November could cost a week's work, and she did not examine too closely why sense had never once moved her before he arrived to insist upon it. The invitation to Camden House came in December, ostensibly to catalog a shelf of damaged volumes in the estate library that the housekeeper had been meaning to send down to the village for years and had simply never got round to. Eleanor suspected, riding out in the estate's own carriage with her tools in a wooden case on her knees, that the shelf was somewhat less urgent than the invitation made it sound, and she suspected further, watching the Marquess come down the front steps himself to hand her out, rather than send a footman, that he suspected she suspected it, and that neither of them intended to say so. The library at Camden House ran the length of the west wing, floor to ceiling in dark wood shelving, and Eleanor lost the better part of an hour simply standing in the doorway before she recalled that she had been engaged to work rather than to admire. She found the damaged volumes easily enough, a shelf of poetry and sermons gone soft at the joints from a leak some years back, and she was midway through her assessment when her hand closed on a slim book bound in blue morocco that she recognized at once, because she had rebound it herself, not 3 months before. For Charlotte. From her brother. On her 16th birthday. She turned, the book still in her hands, and found the Marquess watching her from the doorway, with an expression she had not yet seen on him, something that had given up, for the moment, on being composed. Charlotte had been his younger sister, he told her, and there had been a portrait of her once above the mantel in this very room, taken down 9 years ago because their mother could not bear to look at it and had never permitted it to go back up. Charlotte had wanted, at 18, to marry a curate's son from Devonshire, a young man of no fortune and considerable kindness, and their mother had refused it absolutely and arranged instead a match with a viscount 3 times Charlotte's age, a man of excellent property and indifferent temper, because the family's own fortunes had wanted mending that season, and a viscount's settlement was the readiest tool at hand. He had been 24 at the time, and newly come into what influence a younger son of a Marquess might claim, and he had argued for his sister as hard as he knew how, and his mother had listened to the whole of it with perfect composure, and married Charlotte to the Viscount regardless, because a mother's composure, he had learned that year, was not the same thing as a mother's yielding. Charlotte had died in childbed 18 months later, in a house 4 counties distant, attended by servants rather than family, because the roads had been bad and the summons had come too late for anyone who loved her to reach her in time. He had promised himself, standing at her grave in a black coat too new to have been worn to anything but a funeral, that he would not stand by a second time and watch his mother arrange the whole of someone's happiness for the sake of a settlement, whatever the cost of refusing her turned out to be. Eleanor set the book down very carefully on the shelf. She did not say that she was sorry, because sorry seemed a small coin for so large a grief, and she did not reach for his hand, though she wanted to, because there were servants somewhere in the house, and a whole world beyond the library doors that would make of such a gesture something neither of them yet had the standing to defend. She said only that the book had come to her in poor condition, and she was glad to have made it whole again. And something in his face, hearing this, loosened by a further degree, as though whole again were a phrase he had needed to hear applied to something that belonged to Charlotte, even second-hand, even by accident. It was that evening, over a dinner Eleanor had not been invited to, but had been asked to stay for regardless, at a table set for 6 with the dowager seated at its head, that the second voicing came, delivered not in a corridor aside but across a full soup course, in company, where it could do the most work. The dowager remarked, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, that it was a curious modern habit, this inviting of tradesmen's daughters to dine among family, and that she supposed the next generation would think nothing of seating a bookbinder beside a bishop, provided the bookbinder's hands were clean enough to bear the comparison. Lady Frances Pelham, seated at the dowager's right hand in pale rose silk, laughed the small laugh that required no real amusement behind it, and said that she was sure Miss Vane's hands were very clean indeed, for a tradeswoman's, and the table's attention settled on Eleanor, with the particular weight of a room deciding, collectively, that she had been sufficiently placed. Eleanor set down her spoon and said, in a voice she kept admirably level, that her hands were clean because the work required it, and that she had never yet met a bishop whose hands were cleaner than a bookbinder's, only better gloved. It was not a large defiance. It was not meant to be. She saw the Marquess's mouth move, all the same, very briefly, in something that was almost, and was not quite, a smile, and she understood, watching it, that she had just done something the dowager would not soon forgive her for. The dowager did not raise her voice again that winter. She did not need to. Within a fortnight, Silas Vane called at the shop with a new solemnity to his manner, and informed his cousin that the note her father had signed against the lease had changed hands, purchased outright by a party he was not at liberty to name, and that the new holder had indicated a preference for prompt and full repayment, rather than the quiet quarterly arrangement Josiah Vane had kept for years. Eleanor did not ask whom Silas meant. She did not need to be told twice what kind of influence could purchase a tradesman's debt on a whim and call it a preference. She did not tell the Marquess. She told herself this was pride, and perhaps it was, but it was also something more honest than pride, a reluctance to become, in his eyes or her own, a woman who had to be rescued from her circumstances rather than one who managed them. She began instead to work later and to eat less, and to set aside every spare shilling against a debt that had, overnight, grown teeth. He noticed anyway. He noticed the shadows beneath her eyes, and the way she flinched, very slightly, when Tam mentioned in passing that Mr. Vane's nephew had been round again, and he asked her directly, one Thursday afternoon, with the fire burned low and the shop otherwise empty, what precisely had changed. She told him, because he asked in a voice that made refusal feel like a smaller cruelty than the truth would be, and she watched his face go still and careful in the particular way she had come to recognize as the shape his anger took when he did not yet trust himself to spend it. He did not tell her what he meant to do about it. He asked her instead, with no preamble she could trace, to walk with him as far as the church and back. And when she had her cloak on, he told her, in the plain, unadorned sentences he kept for things that mattered most, that he did not intend to let his mother's preferences decide the shape of anyone's life again, not while he had breath and a title and the means to prevent it, and that he would ask her, formally, in the proper season, to marry him if she would have a man whose family had already cost her a great deal, simply by existing. Eleanor told him she needed to think. It was not a refusal. It was the plain truth of a woman who had learned, the hard way, that wanting a thing badly was no guarantee of being permitted to keep it, and she would not build a hope she could not afford to lose on the strength of one walk to the church and back. The dowager, informed of the proposal by whatever quiet channel informed her of most things in her own house, moved with a speed that suggested she had been preparing the ground for some time already. Within the week, a notice appeared in the county paper announcing an understanding between the Marquess of Camden and Lady Frances Pelham, an understanding Julian had given no one leave to announce, published nonetheless with the particular confidence of a woman who had learned long ago that a thing declared publicly enough became, for most practical purposes, a thing already done. Eleanor read it standing at her own counter, Mrs. Hale having brought the paper round specially, her face arranged with the careful gentleness of a woman delivering news she wished were not true. Eleanor did not weep. She had promised herself some years before, over another grief entirely, that she would not weep in front of people who expected it of her. And she kept the promise now, though it cost her considerably more than it had the first time. It was Tam who brought her the third voicing, 2 days later, having heard it from a carter who had heard it from a footman at Camden House. The dowager, entertaining callers in her morning room, had remarked, in reference to the county paper's announcement, that she was gratified to see the family's affairs restored to a proper footing at last, after a season's foolish flirtation with a shopkeeper's daughter, who had, in fairness, kept her hands cleaner than the connection generally warranted, though clean hands had never yet purchased a woman a place at anyone's table who was not born to sit there. Eleanor thanked Tam for telling her, and went on with the order she had been filling, and did not, until she had gone up to her room that night and shut the door, permit herself to sit down on the edge of her bed and hold very still, the way a person holds still when a wound has gone past the point where movement helps. Silas Vane called again 3 days after that, this time with a letter formally demanding repayment of the full note within the fortnight, a sum Eleanor could not raise in a year, let alone 14 days, and she understood, reading it at her own counter with her hands gone very cold, that the shop her father had built with 30 years of patient work was now a thing that could be taken from her by a signature she had never been permitted to see. She thought, briefly and without much hope, of writing to the Marquess. She did not send the letter. A woman announced in the county paper as another man's understanding had no business asking favors of the man whose mother had arranged the announcement, whatever the truth of his own intentions had been. The winter subscription assembly fell on the second Thursday of the new year, in the same long room where Eleanor had first felt herself watched without pretense, and she went only because Mrs. Hale insisted a body could not simply stop appearing in the world on account of one hard winter, and because the 10 shillings a delivery of mended hymnals would earn her was 10 shillings she could not now afford to refuse. She had not expected the Marquess to be there. She had heard from Mrs. Hale that the engagement to Lady Frances was to be formally read at the assembly itself, the dowager having decided that a public setting would fix the matter beyond any further foolish delay on her son's part. Eleanor set her basket down at the subscription table with hands that did not shake, because she had had a great deal of practice by now at hands that did not shake, and she was turning to leave before the reading could begin, when the room's ordinary murmur changed pitch behind her. The particular hush of a crowd noticing something before it has words for what it has noticed. The Marquess of Camden was crossing the room. He was not walking toward the dais where the vicar stood with the evening's notices in hand, nor toward his mother, seated in state near the front with Lady Frances arranged at her side in white and diamonds, prepared for an announcement she had every reason to believe was hers. He was walking toward the back wall, toward the subscription table, toward Eleanor, and he was walking with the unhurried, deliberate gait of a man who had spent a great many weeks arriving at a decision, and did not intend to arrive at it slowly now that it was made. The dowager rose from her seat. Eleanor heard the silk of it, the small, sharp rustle of a woman rising faster than her dignity generally permitted. She did not turn to look. She was watching him, and the whole room, she understood distantly, had turned to watch him too, the reading forgotten, the vicar's notices lowered, 300 candles throwing a soft gold light across a silence that had gone, in the space of 10 strides, entirely still. He stopped before her close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes, and he did not touch her, though his hand came up as far as her elbow and stopped there, hovering, as though even now he would not presume without her leave. He said her name. Not Miss Vane, not the careful formal address he had used at every prior meeting where other ears might carry it forward, but Eleanor, spoken once, quietly, the first time she had heard it in his voice at all. Then he said, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the room and no farther, that he would marry Eleanor Vane, or he would marry no one. 11 words. She counted them afterward, lying awake, unable to help herself. 11 words, spoken once, in the same room where a voice she knew well had once called her a curiosity not worth the noticing. The dowager's composure, so carefully maintained across 9 years and 100 smaller cruelties, did not shatter so much as fold quietly in on itself, the way a fine fabric gives way at last along a seam it has been strained against too long. She said his name once, a warning that had lost, in the saying, whatever authority it had once carried. He did not look at her. Lady Frances, to her credit, had already begun to draw her hand from where it rested near the dowager's arm, her face arranged in something closer to relief than injury. A woman released, Eleanor understood later, from an understanding she had never much wanted either. It was Mr. Aldous Kemp, the family's own solicitor, called forward by some earlier arrangement of the Marquess's that Eleanor had known nothing about, who stepped from the crowd near the door and confirmed, in the flat, unromantic language of his profession, that the note held against the Vane Bindery lease had that morning been purchased and settled in full, and that the property stood now, and would stand henceforth, in Miss Vane's own name, unencumbered, a wedding gift the Marquess had arranged before he had any certainty at all that it would be received as one. The room, hearing this, made the small collective sound a crowd makes when it has watched a verdict overturned in the same hour it was rendered. And Eleanor felt her eyes go hot at last, in front of every person she had once believed thought nothing of her, and did not, this time, trouble to stop them. They were married in April, in the small stone church at Ashcombe, rather than in town, because Eleanor had asked for it. And Julian had found, once she asked, that he wanted nothing else either. The dowager attended, seated near the back rather than at the front, in a gesture of accommodation that cost her a great deal, and that Eleanor, watching her take the seat without complaint, found she was able to forgive, if not yet to forget entirely. Lady Frances sent a letter of good wishes from Bath, where she had gone, by her own choosing, to spend a season free of arrangements made on her behalf, and the letter was warmer than either of them had any obligation to make it. The bindery kept its lamp lit past dark still, though Eleanor worked shorter hours now, with Tam managing the counter most days, and a new apprentice, a quick-fingered boy from the village school, learning the bench beside her the way she had once learned it beside her father. The shop stood in her own name, exactly as Mr. Kemp had promised, and she had insisted, over Julian's mild objection, on repaying him in full for the note within the first year of their marriage, because a debt settled by love was still, she told him, a debt, and she would not begin a marriage owing more than she could account for. Charlotte's book of poems came to live at the bindery rather than in the estate library, set on a small shelf above Eleanor's own bench, where the light fell kindest in the afternoon, because Julian had asked her to keep it there, close to the hands that had made it whole again, rather than shut away in a room his mother still could not enter without a particular stillness coming over her face. On the evening of their first Christmas as husband and wife, with snow coming down soft and steady past the bindery windows and the fire built up high against the cold, Julian found his wife exactly where he had first found her worth finding, bent over her bench with her sleeves pinned back and her whole attention given to the careful, patient work of making something broken whole again. He did not tell her to come away from it this time. He only drew a second chair up beside hers, near enough that their shoulders touched, and sat with her in the particular quiet of two people who had each spent a great many years believing themselves unlikely to be chosen, and had each, against considerable odds and one determined mother's opposition, been chosen anyway. Eleanor set down her needle at last and reached for his hand instead, ink stain and all, and held it a long moment in the firelight, without either of them feeling any need to say what it meant. Outside, the snow went on falling over Ashcombe, softening the roofs and the church spire and the long dark road to Camden House, and inside, the lamp burned on a while longer, the way it always had, though there was no longer any hurry in the burning of it at all. If you have stayed until the end of Eleanor and Julian's story, thank you for keeping it company through every page. Their book is closed now, whole and well bound, exactly as her father would have wished it kept.